He was born into a town that ate its children. Smokestacks and shuttered factories defined the skyline. Rusted rail yards cut through neighborhoods like scars, and the streets seemed to exist only to swallow up dreams. People drank hard, fought harder, and prayed little. By the time Marcus McDoyle was old enough to walk, he'd already learned to keep his head down when sirens wailed and to run when glass broke in the night. The apartment where he grew up had walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing through, and floors so warped you could roll a ball and watch it find the lowest corner. His mother Charlene worked double shifts at a diner off the interstate. His father had vanished before Mac was old enough to remember his face. Some said the man was locked upstate. Others whispered he had gone south, chasing a union job that never came. Mac stopped asking. The only constant in his life was his mother's weary voice telling him to eat something, to stay out of trouble, to make it through another day without ending up in the county jail like half the boys on his block. By 10. He ran with kids who smoked behind the corner store, who slipped candy bars under jackets and ran laughing down alleys. He had a temper that flared quick. Teachers kept him after class, trying to tame the anger in his eyes. But Mac felt like the whole world was against him. The only place he found quiet was when he sprinted, legs pumping, lungs burning, shoes slapping cracked pavement as if he could run fast enough to leave the town behind. Football arrived by accident. In 7th grade, a coach spotted him racing older kids in the schoolyard and told him he had speed that didn't come around often. Mac shrugged him off until the man put a ball in his hands and told him to run. He did, cutting through Woodby. Tacklers with the instinct of a street kid dodging cops. By the time he reached the other end of the field, the coach was grinning like he'd struck oil. Practice became the first structured thing in Mac's life. The whistle, the lines painted on grass, the rules, it all felt foreign but grounding. For once, fights had purpose. Hits weren't chaos, they were expected. Mac learned that his rage could be sharpened into something useful. He dropped his shoulder and plowed through bigger boys, learned to juke left when they came in high, learned to plant his foot and cut like the world depended on it. And in those moments, under the fading sun, with dirt on his knees and sweat dripping into his eyes, he felt something like freedom. But trouble didn't leave just because football showed up. By 14, Mac was running with a crew that boosted radios from cars and tagged underpasses. He got picked up once for fighting. Outside a liquor store, blood still dripping from his knuckles, when the cops shoved him into the back of the cruiser. The only thing that saved him from a juvenile record was his coach showing up at the precinct, shaking hands with the sergeant and vouching that the boy still had a chance. Mac spent the next 2 weeks running extra suicides at practice lungs, burning so bad he swore he'd cough blood. The coach told him it was a small price to pay for the second chance. High school came, and the field became his stage. Friday nights lit up with cheap stadium lights, bleachers packed with tired factory workers who wanted something to cheer for. Mac gave them reason. He ran like he was being chased by all the demons in town, legs churning, arms pumping, cutting. Through defenders with the fury of someone who refused to be caught, his name spread fast, whispers first, then local headlines. Scouts from nearby colleges began showing up, clipboards in hand, eyes wide when he broke 3 tackles and sprinted 60 yards untouched. Still, the old life tugged at him. After games, his friends pulled him into parties that stank of beer and weed. He got into fights, threw punches in dark basements lit only by a single swinging bulb. Teachers warned him he was wasting his gift. His mother begged him not to throw away the one thing that could save him. Didn't listen much, but deep down, he knew she was right. Football was the only thing keeping him from drowning in the same mud that had swallowed up so many others. By senior year, the whole town knew his name. Colleges mailed letters thick with promises. Recruiters shook his hand after games, calling him son like they'd known him forever. For the first time in his life, Mac saw a road out of the rust and the sirens. The road wasn't straight. He nearly blew it when a fight after a playoff game sent a kid to the hospital with a broken jaw. The newspapers called him a thug in cleats. Scouts started backing off. His mother cried at the kitchen table, head in her hands. Mac thought it was over. Then came the state championship. He broke records that night, rushing yards, touchdowns, carries, Every run was fueled by anger and desperation, as if he could outrun his past if he'd just crossed the goal line enough times. They won, and in the morning paper, his name was no longer attached to fights. It was attached to glory. That performance saved him. The scouts came back. The letters returned. When the day came to choose, he picked a college far from the rust of home. Somewhere that smelled different, where the air didn't taste like smoke. His mother hugged him like she was afraid he'd vanish, and maybe he did, in a way. In his place was Marcus Doyle, rising star, running back, in the hope of a town that hadn't had anything to cheer for in decades. But deep down, he carried the old streets with him, the fists, the fire, the hunger. Football had saved him, but it hadn't erased who he was. And he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the fight wasn't over. It had just moved to a bigger stage. College hit him like a clean tackle he never saw coming. The campus was wide and green, and the buildings wore brick-like armor polished by generations of students who had never watched their neighbors hauled away in cuffs. The air smelled like cut grass and coffee instead of hot asphalt and old oil. People walked like they expected to arrive somewhere. Matt carried his duffel across a lawn that looked like a photograph and felt both huge and small at the same time. Like he had stepped onto a television set where the other actors already knew their lines. The running backs coach met him on the practice field with a whistle that never left his mouth and eyes that never stopped measuring. The man shook his hand once, firm and short, then pointed at a line of cones. Mac ran until the world narrowed and the ground under his feet felt like a drum. He cut hard, he leaned, he found the space, and he sensed the eyes on the berm rise. A little as the kids in new team gear nudged each other. Speed was not something you could buy. You either had the gift or you did not. He had it. In the first weeks, he learned that talent bought a chair at the table, but discipline kept your seat. His position coach corrected the angle of his toes, the height of his elbow, the way he held the ball against his ribs, as if someone meant to take it at every step. The weight room became a second home that smelled of iron and chalk, and the stairwell to his dorm became a hill he had to climb without thinking. Film sessions showed him things he had never seen, the way linebackers leaned before the snap, the space behind a pulling guard that opened for a heartbeat and then closed like a fist. He sat with a notebook and wrote the way he had never written. For a class, filling pages with arrows and margins, with reminders until the scribbles looked like a language. He was learning to speak. He tried to be invisible off the field. The campus swelled with kids who looked clean and tired and sure of themselves. He went to study hall and kept his head down. He ate in the training table room where the food came bland and plentiful. At night, he lay on his narrow bed and listened to a silence that felt heavy, the kind that arrives in places where everyone has somewhere to be. He missed the radio from the apartment above the locksmith, and he missed the way the street hummed even when nothing was happening. He did not miss the sirens. He told himself the silence was the sound of a future. There were parties. There were always parties when a team that mattered was in season. He learned to be careful. Kid from the suburbs with a new camera followed him from keg to porch and back one night as if Mac were a comet that might spark. He left early and walked the long way around the library to lose the eyes. He was not afraid of men. He was afraid of headlines. The staff had given a talk the second week. It was not a talk about football. It was a talk about optics and boosters and the way a story could swallow a season whole. In a class where a boy with soft hands made a joke about kids from rust towns, Mac felt his jaw clench and his vision narrow. He kept his seat. When the lecture ended, he took the long steps down the aisle and leaned close enough that the boy could smell the grass on his jacket. He said to be careful. He said it softly. The boy nodded with the quickness of someone who has never been close. To anger before, his first college carry came in the second quarter of the first home game, when the starter limped after a helmet snapped his shin pads together. The crowd had been chanting the established name, and the coach sent the freshman onto the field, and a small murmur spread, the curious noise that happens when people lean forward. The quarterback called the play, a simple dive that had been run 10,000 times by 10,000 backs. The ball hit Mac's stomach, and the world slowed the way it always did when he ran. The hole was narrow, then open. He slipped through. The hands that reached for him bounced off a body, redirected into daylight, and broke outside where the white chalk beckoned. He ran 50 yards and did not look back, because looking back is for people who doubt. The stadium became a bowl of sound. He flipped the ball to the official and jogged to the bench and held his helmet against his hip because he had seen other men do that. He wanted to look like he belonged. Belonging happened in layers. He learned the cafeteria lady's name, and she learned how he liked his eggs. He learned where in the weight room the bar knurled just right so that his grip did not slip. He learned which professor would let him hand in a paper on Monday morning if he returned from an away game at dawn. He learned that sleep in season was a currency, spent and regretted, never saved. The team started winning. The line in front of him opened holes because they wanted to see what he would do with them. The receivers cracked down on safeties because they liked how he thanked them after he bounced outside. The quarterback stopped changing out of run plays at the line because he liked the way the crowd rose when Mac cut past a linebacker who had chosen the wrong gap. Saturdays became a procession. His name skittered across the bottom of the television screen during highlights. Reporters asked about his childhood with eyes that tried to be gentle. He answered carefully and not untruthfully. He talked about his mother, and the diner, and the coach who pulled him out of the precinct. He did not mention the fights behind the liquor store. Trouble still found him once. It took nothing more than a wrong turn after a study session, and the old itched in his fists when a voice said something about where he came from. The punch landed like a secret. Now the other boy fell wrong and lay still too long. Mac ran to his car with his chest burning and sat behind the wheels shaking while the old town rose in his head like smoke. He thought about driving. He thought about never stopping. He drove to the facility instead and told the assistant who always kept the lights on late. The police came and wrote things on pads and shook their heads and left with words about witnesses. Inversions. The head coach called it a misunderstanding and a teachable moment. The boy with the wrong turn had a fractured cheekbone and a family that wanted a settlement instead of a courtroom. Mac ran stairs until his legs failed. He thought about the line he had crossed and the line he had not. He told himself he had used up the last of his mistakes. He ran like a man who owed time money. Bowl season came, and the spotlight grew white and hot. The stadium in January lay in a southern city that smelled like citrus and spilled beer. Cameras found his face on the sideline and held it as if it were a promise. The other team had a linebacker who would be drafted in the first round, and he met Mac in the hole on the second series with a thud that echoed all the way to the press box. They stared at each other for a beat, both men breathing hard, both men aware that this was one of the moments people would talk about in bars. Next play, Mac cut outside instead and made the big man chase him to the sideline. A series later, he stepped through the line where the guard had sealed a crease and felt nothing but air for 12 yards. He lowered his pads at the safety and bounced off, and the field opened like a door. He ran under the lights that make sweat look like metal and crossed the line while the scoreboard rotated numbers. That night, he could hear the radio in the hotel bathroom while the shower ran. They said his name as if it belonged to them. The winter, after the bowl game, turned into a blur of early mornings and cold thighs, and agents who laughed without showing teeth. Mac thought he could return for one more year. The coaches thought he might go pro, and so did his body, which felt the future in the ache behind his knees when he climbed stairs. He sat in his apartment with the blinds open and stared at the parking lot where students came and went with hands shoved in pockets and books under arms. He thought about the town he had left and the apartment above the locksmith and the way the street led up. When the bar across the way placed a sign on the sidewalk, he thought about his mother and the phone calls in which she tried not to sound proud. He signed with a man whose shoes were too shiny, and told himself that sometimes shiny shoes walk you through the right door. The spring combine was a carnival with stopwatches. He stood in line in a shirt with a number that meant he had become an object to be measured. He ran, he jumped, he pushed metal off his chest, while men with clipboards watched without expression. He answered questions about his past. He told truths that sounded more acceptable than other truths. He sat in hotel rooms under soft lights while men with rings on their fingers asked whether he would be able to behave when people gave him more than he had ever had. He said he could, meant it at the time. Draft day arrived with a tie that did not feel like his. The television crew set up in his mother's living room, and a cousin kept telling people to move because the camera needed the right angle. His mother wore a dress that had not seen sunlight in years and sat with her hands folded so tight the knuckles went white. The room clapped politely, because that is what rooms on television do. Mac sat forward without seeming to. When the phone finally rang in the middle of the first round, and the voice on the other end said, "Welcome to the city," and said the number that would change everything, he stood and looked at his mother first, and then at the camera, because the producer had told him to. He hugged everyone in the room. He walked outside. The street looked like it always had. His neighbors yelled and laughed, and someone fired a cap gun because that was what you did in that neighborhood when there was joy. The new city smelled like ocean and money. The facility looked like a spaceship landed in a parking lot. The locker room sounded like what you would expect when men who had spent their lives trying to be faster than other men find themselves in one place. He took a locker near the wall and placed his helmet as if it were a living thing that might be offended by carelessness. Veterans nodded at him with eyes that held no opinion yet. Rookies gathered together like new kids on the first day, pretending not to be nervous. The head coach shook his hand and clapped a hand on his shoulder and said they drafted him because he ran angry. The sun bore down on green grass, cut into lines of white precision. He woke sore and went to bed sore. He learned the weight of the playbook and the way a story can be written with footsteps and a gap. He tried to be the first on the field because someone told him someone always wrote it down when you were the first on the field. On the veteran back in front of him on the depth chart, a man with knees like old stories and a way of reading blocks that felt like cheating. The veteran spoke little and watched everything. One day he sidled up to Mac and murmured that there are 3 kinds of hits in this league. The ones you decide to take, the ones you decide to give, and the ones you never see. He told him to make sure most of his were decisions he made himself. Then he walked away and left Mac with a feeling that he had heard something like scripture. His first professional carry came in a preseason game that did not count and mattered anyway. And the men on the other side were stronger, and the angles closed faster, but the rhythm was the same, and rhythm is everything. He fell forward. He got up. He did it again. The coaches nodded. The reporters scribbled. The next week, he spun off a tackle and landed on his feet, and the stadium made a noise that told him this was going to be a place he could live. The season began with a roar that settled into a grind. He learned the taste of his mouthpiece at the end of long drives, and the way the ball felt when it was cold enough to sting. He learned how fans could love you in the first quarter and question your lineage in the fourth. He learned that losing made men go quiet in elevators. He learned that the city could feel like a jacket that either fit or chafed depending on the scoreboard. He carried the ball. He met men in holes. He heard the pads pop and the crowd rise. And he gave pieces of himself away 1 yard at a time. He bought his mother a house on a quiet street where the lawns looked like they were measured. Weekly, he stood in the kitchen and tried to see her there as a girl, tried to imagine what it would have felt like to grow up without the sound of sirens. She cried when he handed her the keys and then made him a sandwich in the new kitchen with hands that trembled. Sat at the breakfast bar and felt both huge and small again, like he had at the campus, like he would for the rest of his life. The city found a way to love him. Kids wore his number in parks and on corners. He started to see jerseys with his name where he never expected to see his name. He moved through restaurants with a hat pulled low and learned which places would let him eat in peace and which rooms wanted him to be someone for them. He smiled when he had energy and nodded when he did not. He signed napkins and tickets and a shoe once. He posed with babies while mothers cried, and he let them because he understood the moment. It was not about him. He met her at a charity gala where the food was delicate and the speeches were long. She had eyes that laughed and hair that moved when she turned her head, and a way of listening that made him forget there were waiters passing with trays. She said she did some modeling. She said she had grown up near here and had stories about sneaking into ball games as a kid. She did not mention any of the parts of his life that had been written up. She asked about his mother and about whether he cooked. He looked at her and felt his chest lift in a way that had nothing to do with conditioning. He asked if she liked diner coffee. She said she liked any coffee if the company was right. They married in the off-season on a warm day near the water. The team sent flowers so big they looked like hedges. A magazine printed a photo where he looked like a statue, and she looked like a flamenco dancer trying to be still. He thought about how quickly life had turned and how the old apartment above the locksmith now felt like a story he would have to tell someone to keep real. He carried her across a threshold one evening and believed the ground was finally steady. Under his feet, the games kept coming, and he kept running. Endorsements found him. The checks did not bounce. He sent money to a friend who had not left the old town and did not call to ask whether it had arrived because he knew pride can be a delicate bridge. He flew relatives to games and hugged them by the bus and nodded when they told him his life lifted them somehow. He nodded and did not know how to answer. Trouble has a way of using doors you did not know were unlocked. It began as whispers in rooms where he was not present. It became a photograph of his wife leaving a restaurant with someone who looked like a man who lifted weights for a living. He saw it in a newspaper on a morning when the sun was kind and the food smelled like cinnamon. He folded the paper and placed it under a box of cereal and sat there with his hands flat on the table. He told himself there were explanations. Told himself there were always explanations. He asked her and she laughed and said tabloids needed to fill pages. He asked again and watched her eyes move. He slept beside her and stared at the ceiling and heard the old rust town in the pipes as if it had traveled with him. He played the next Sunday with a jaw so tight his mouthpiece tasted of rubber and salt.
Ow.
He ran like a man who had lost something he could not name. The cameras loved the way anger looks like effort. He learned slowly and then all at once. Men called his phone from numbers he did not know. Text blinked while he was in the training room, and he picked it up without thinking. He scrolled because the mind looks for a floor even when it is falling. He saw messages that felt like strikes of metal. He sat in his car after the night meeting and stared at his hands and thought about the veteran, who had warned him about hits you choose and hits you do not see. He had not seen this one. It would leave a bruise he could not tape. He tried to forgive. The nights he had stayed out after late winds and found himself at the edge of rooms where the air hummed, he did not cross lines then because he had made rules that were simple and had always kept him. But he had walked close enough to feel the heat. He told himself that a marriage was a field where you sometimes missed a tackle and then found the angle and made the play anyway. He suggested counseling. She shrugged. He stayed late in the weight room to avoid the kitchen. The season ended in a locker room that smelled like winter and effort. He took his pads off slowly and looked at the bruises on his thighs that had become maps. He thought about the house where the television would be on when he arrived and where the sound would not cover the silence. He drove around the block twice before parking. He walked in and put his keys on the counter and found the suitcase by the door. It was not his. She said she needed time. She said everyone wanted something from her too. She said she was tired of being a statue in photographs of his life. He asked if there was someone else, and she did not answer, and the quiet said plenty. He opened his mouth and felt his father's absence move like a shadow across the room. Nodded once. He told her he would call a lawyer in the morning, and he did. Divorce was a season with no bye weeks. Papers, meetings, accounts, valuations, interviews for magazines he did not agree to. There were pictures of him walking out of offices, and a man with a voice like a cartoon read them on television while nighttime people laughed softly. The team said it was personal, and then someone with a badge on his polo asked if everything was all right, and then asked it again later when his carries went down and his eyes looked tired in the team photo. He said he was fine and meant that he was standing. Fine is a word that carries a lot of weight for its size. Injuries came like rain after a long drought. First a hamstring that felt like it snapped off bone and whipped back. Then a shoulder. That left his arm hanging for a game in a month. Then a knee that swelled slowly and did not want to go down. He healed and came back because that is what you do, but something had tilted. The defenses in front of him felt younger. Angles closed faster. The holes stayed small. A heartbeat longer than he remembered, and then shut. He still found space. Because he had always been able to find space. Still fell forward because he had promised himself he would. But the long runs that feel like childhood, those became memories you watched on film rather than days you lived. He lost money in ways that were both fast and polite. An investment in a restaurant chain that had looked certain wilted under bad management and weather. The divorce took a slice that did not look big until it sat next to the other slices. He still made more in a year than his mother had made in a decade. It made the math crueler. He fired a financial advisor and hired another and walked out of the meeting with a binder under his arm that felt heavier than it should have. He went home and stood in the kitchen and told himself there would always be next season. And he believed it, because belief is a muscle he had trained since the first time. Ran past a boy older than him. He began to sleep at odd hours. He would wake in the dark and walk through a house that hummed like a spaceship, and he would put his hand on walls as he moved, as if touch could remind him the space was real. He turned the television on without sound and watched games from decades ago, where the colors looked wrong. He sat at the edge of his bed and stared at his phone, and did not call anyone because he did not know what he would say. And yet some mornings he rose with the same stubborn joy he had felt as a boy when the coach placed the ball in his hands and told him to run. He told jokes in the running back's room because humor can cover splinters. He took young players aside and whispered a few things men had whispered to him. He told them about the 3 kinds of hits. He told them about the way the ball should ride on their ribs like it was part of them. He told them to call their mothers. He found a field one afternoon in late spring when the season had ended, and the world felt slow. A high school on the edge of town with bleachers that had rust at the bolts, and a scoreboard that blinked wrong when the sun hit it. A cluster of kids ran drills with a coach who wore a whistle and fatigue like an old jacket. Mac sat on the top row and watched. The coach saw him and waved and then pretended not to watch back. After a while, Mac walked down and asked if he could help with footwork. The coach handed him a ladder and stepped back like a man who had been waiting for this moment and wanted not to scare it away. Mac set the ladder on the grass and clapped his hands and spoke to the kids in a voice that made them stand taller without knowing why. He stayed until the sun began to slide and the shadows from the goalposts stretched long over the field. He thanked the coach, and the coach thanked him. Neither man made a speech. He went back the next week and the week after that. He stood in the heat and in the wind and in the thin rain that falls when the weather cannot decide. He watched a boy who ran like a deer, and a boy who had hands like magnets, and a boy who tripped over his own feet and laughed at himself before anyone else could. He told them that sometimes you do everything right and a guard misses and you get blasted anyway, and the lesson is not about blame, it is about getting up. He told them that a town that eats its children can be taught a new appetite if enough kids run fast enough for long enough. He told them to take care of their friends. He told them to listen more than they talked. He told them that the world would try to use their story against them, and they could decide whether to sell it or to hold it close. When the next season began, he ran with a steadiness that felt different from the old Fury. He made fewer headlines and more first downs. The fans noticed only that the chains moved. The coaches noticed that there were fewer days in the training room and more in the film room. He still found the old ache in his chest where betrayal had left a bruise. He still sat in his car after late meetings and stared at his hands and thought about how far those hands had carried him. He found breakfasts where coffee tasted like something other than fuel. He found a way to make quiet without needing a television turned low. He found that a life can be built from the little things you do when no one is watching. When he finally left the game, it was not a ceremony. It was a conversation in an office that smelled like leather, where a coach with sad eyes said they wanted to get younger, and where a general manager with a spreadsheet said words about value in windows. He shook hands. He drove to the high school and walked onto the field and stood at the 50 and closed his eyes. He could hear pads pop from years ago, and he could hear his coach from middle school, and he could hear his mother call his name from a bleacher where she never sat because she always worked. He opened his eyes and breathed air that felt easy. He coached because it made sense. He began as a volunteer who fixed footwork and kept time. He stayed because boys who had never been told to breathe through failure started to do it and then started to run freer. He ran routes with receivers and took handoffs in skinny jeans and laughed when the kids hooted at his form and then shut up when he planted and cut and left them tapping their helmets in respect. He taught them the ladder, taught them how to tuck a ball against ribs, and how to spin their hips through contact and how to keep their mouths closed in rooms where people wanted to pull their story out like a coin trick. He taught them to write their names clean on forms and to ask questions when a pen slid across a desk. He lived in a smaller house where the quiet felt earned. He kept his old jerseys in a box and his rings in a drawer he did not open often. Visited his mother on Sundays and brought groceries she did not need. He ran in the mornings before the town woke, sneakers thudding on sidewalks that looked like his first city, but were not. Sometimes he dated, sometimes he did not. He did not rush the shape of the rest of his life. Let it grow like grass in. Late spring, on a late autumn evening, he sat high in the bleachers while the sun sank and the field lights clicked on one by one with sounds like insects waking. Kids laughed near the concession stand and a whistle blew on the track where someone practiced starts. He could smell leaves and a hint of gasoline and the kind of cold that sharpens the world. He thought about the first time a coach had handed him a ball. He thought about the first time he had heard his own name shouted by strangers as if it belonged to them. He thought about the night he held a newspaper closed with his palm and the morning he signed dissolution papers in a room where the fluorescent lights did not flicker out of mercy. He thought about the way the body carries, the memory of every hit and every run and every decision you make about who you will be. A boy on the field below cut through a lane of cones and stumbled and then found his feet without losing speed. Mac felt a smile tug his face. He stood and put his hands in his pockets and walked down the steps slowly, knees sending up notices the way old friends do. At the fence, the coach turned and saw him and nodded. Mac nodded back and stepped through the gate. The field under his shoes felt like it always had, springy and patient, ready to hold the weight of men who believed that running still mattered. He clapped his hands, and the boys gathered without being told. He showed them a drill, and then another. He planted and cut and laughed when he slipped, and then did it again until he did not slip. He told them about 3 kinds of hits and watched the words land. Watched a boy with tired eyes listen harder. Then the others and knew the kid needed more than drills. He told the boy to stay after. He told the coach he would lock the gate. When the sun was gone and the lights made the air look like something you could drink, he stood in the middle of the field and tilted his head back. The sky above the stadium was not the sky of the old town or the city or the campus. It was the sky of this place. This night, this breath he took and let out, he felt whole, not perfect and not finished, and not a statue. A man who had carried a ball and carried a name and carried a hurt and then set things down one by one until he could stand without leaning. He walked off the field and turned the key in the gate and listened to the click. He liked the sound. It reminded him of a latch on a window in spring. He put the keys in his pocket and headed for the parking lot where his car sat under a light that hummed. He thought of the kids who would run here tomorrow and the day after. He thought of the town that might learn a new appetite. He thought of the boy he had been and the man he had become. He got in his car and started the engine and drove home on roads that knew him.